All right, so we want to talk about what's been going on, obviously, with add-ons. This is kind of a historic thing within the community. For me and my experience with Final Fantasy, add-ons and stuff really kind of trend all the way back to Final Fantasy XI's days. And so what we are seeing here is a lot of different, forces, a lot of different opinions, all kind of coming together against terms of service that has been established for 20 years.
Sure.
And the enforcement of that service of that department that handles it finally got funded this year, and that ended up kind of causing a lot of struggle, a lot of frustration within the community, especially those who have been using add-ons this entire time and those who haven't. And then obviously then you have the witch hunters within the community that feel like they have to be the the enforcers of the will of somebody, or what have you. So, what, Chris? Why don't you break down what specifically kind of kicked this next round of the add-on drama off, and then we'll kind of break it down for you guys. What our thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, my history with WoW or with WoW and stuff obviously means I was exposed to add-ons back when you used to have to like manually go drag them into the folder and stuff before all these like curse clients and everything. I've come from that background. This is not a change of stance. It's never been allowed here. But this one's a little bit different. So this time around, we use way markers in advanced dungeon content and in trials, extreme trials and savage raids, so that we can call out locations on the arena. Typically, arenas in Final Fantasy are these kind of circles or squares. They're these big open rooms. It's not, it's not like WoW raids where you have 20 people, so it really expounds into being a whole thing. And sometimes our alliance raids kind of feel like that. It's typically just a circle, and so where you call things out, even if the floor is decently has a pattern on it, it's not always helpful. But those markers have been something that, like, how do we place those? And over the years, they've expanded that capability to where now we can have like saved markers and stuff. So it's not as, I guess it was like macro driven before. Ryan and I don't typically spend a lot of time in extreme and savage content, so it's not something that's affected us. But those markers are there to help communicate. And as those marker tools have continued to develop, there is a basic underlying rule that the marker has to be placed on the arena. And that's just to stop somebody from, I guess, accidentally putting it out there. And I think of it like, oh, I'm trying to use one of these abilities. Now we have that ability where like when you drag out something like a charge or whatever, it caps it on valid locations. And it seems like the way markers were kind of bound by that scan. So when you went to place a marker, that didn't work. But we have arenas this time around in 5 through 8 of Pandemonium that change shape. So now the question is, well, how do I place markers on somewhere that the arena is not right now, but will be? And their suggestion was, well, of course, like once the battle ends, you can place markers anywhere on the final arena, which like covers the whole freaking thing, and then you can save those, and then you'll have them, and it'll let them place them in non-valid locations when you come in next time. Well, on Savage, that's not really that helpful because like waiting until people get clears is ridiculous. So somebody developed a third-party tool that all it did was allow them to place markers in the locations that aren't yet valid. And then once that got saved and those got shared out, those are now shareable by anybody. So you don't know where they came from. Just like anybody else that does not clear Savage blind, you go in with a group in Party Finder or whatever, somebody puts markers down on, you're like, oh, these are really helpful. You save them. You have no idea that these are fruit of the poison tree. So these markers become widespread with anybody progging P7S, and they solve a very legitimate communication problem, in that like they just make sure we're all communicating on the same terms as people who've gotten clears, like kind of, and so it's fine, but it is against terms. So like, is it against the rules? Absolutely. Is it the same as like people that were having add-ons tell them how to do the fight and stuff or something like that? No, it is just allowing them to place that. But here's where it got goofy. The devs then said, this is no longer allowed, but since we don't know if you got your markers from being shared or not, we're asking, please don't use them, and we will not be banning anybody that's used them. And then we're going to go ahead and allow you to place markers in what used to be non-valid areas. So we're going to go ahead and like take what that person did and be like, You're not allowed to do it, and you shouldn't have done it, but it was a really good idea.
But, well, that's also kind of then ties into that's just something that's just generally interesting within where I've seen the community just struggle, right? So originally, Yoshi P came out and said, "Listen, like we clearly see that there's a need, for these things. We're going to go ahead and start looking at these and actually incorporating these features into the game, right?" So
How long did the guy get banned for, by the way? The main guy. They can trace it back to.
Oh, they traced it all the way back to the guy who did it.
Yeah, Patient Zero. He was the very first person to share
if it's his first offense, I would venture to bet that it's like maybe a 7-day. I'll let you look that up while I kind of pontificate here, because one of the things is like them allowing to be able to place markers, like in that regards, like that is in my mind him fulfilling the promise of like, oh, clearly there's a value for this to be had, and so the solution ended up being somebody had to create software that would basically manage that, right? And so that kind of ties back to what Yoshi P said in the spring. But the funniest and the weird frustration is that these add-ons have been a part of these games for a long time. And the policy of basically don't ask, don't tell, like as long as you aren't talking about it in game, we're not gonna go. We can't actually, like the reality is that they're not monitoring what's on your PC. That's caused problems within the PvP space as well, because you have people clearly cheating in that regards. And so there's like this weird line for the longest time where I think Final Fantasy has gotten so popular that some of these problems are now actually becoming problems, or some of these things that weren't problems have crossed over into that space. And so when you start to look at add-ons themselves, I think the greatest kind of fault is that these features that are now being evaluated to be in the game, they should have always been evaluated. But then him saying that is a weird catch-22, because in order to get these things that we want in the game, we have to now have sacrificial lambs to break terms of service so that we can get these things in the game that we need. Oh man, like it's like what, like how does this not end poorly? Or how does this not end where you end up saying, all right, we're going to have to create another account so we can do these things on, so that way we can protect our real accounts, but these are the things that we need for the game to succeed. And then the question easily translates into, but where's the line? Yoshi P said no to damage meters, but yet damage meters are like absolutely used. They are absolutely used to gatekeep. They, all of that is in place and people use that. And even talking with Benny and several of the other like raiders is like, at some point, like you get, if people won't team up because they're worried about getting raid logged because of all these other things. But then you have a tool that's so beautiful like XIV analytics. And my frustration is like, in order to actually really get good at this game, so we can finally put the devs in their place for, having too much HP on a boss, you have to break terms of service to get to the tool that really actually I think is the most beautiful tool that we have within the community. And so it just feels like we're saying one thing, we're doing another, and then randomly we're going to get slapped, and you never know who's really it's going to be. What do you think?
I mean, the people who are already good at this game, the people who have either spent a long time in the first place or have been clearing Savage for multiple tiers, don't need XIV analytics. They don't. And so most people who came from another game at rating, or they've just put a lot of time in, they don't. And so like you don't hurt the existing Savage community if a tool like that goes out of date for a patch cycle or something like that. They're fine. The balance spreadsheets and stuff, like, but these are people who like can think about, hey, at that phase change, I'm going to use this ability, I'm going to save it for that, and then we'll pop this other cooldown, and then they execute. And so like they're already at a skill level where they're in many times actually can point out flaws with things like XIV analytics, because it's not a perfect tool, and they are actually achieving at a level higher than XIV analytics. But to those of us that are a little more blind to our mistakes, and you sit on a target dummy and you do the rotation and you're like, okay, I think I got it. And then you go in and you're like, I was probably fine. But then unless you record yourself, you don't know the mistakes you don't know. And you don't know that when you get flustered and get told to move left and you thought you were going to move right, that actually you just stop pushing other abilities. You're so busy steering that you just lose globals. And when you lose globals, you slide off the 2-minute timers. And as 2-minute timers have become the standard, you are penalizing you and possibly others in the party by sliding off your rotation. But you can't know all of that. Like, unless you're using some tool to document it, or you're already at a skill level where you can do it, there's a gap there. And that's where these tools help. And so to say third-party tools don't help the community, when you look at something like a P8S damage check, how would we know what jobs are behind unless people were doing the math? Because like Red Mage still looks awesome doing all their abilities. They look amazing and they're pressing all their abilities in order and they're doing the right things.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how would we know without doing the math and without a tool that could tell us what the math is in the real ability, just how far off Black Mage they are? They're wildly off. And yet you could see a Black Mage take a damage down throughout a fight and you're like, wow, that guy made a mistake and I didn't. I probably beat him. No, you didn't. No, you didn't, because the gap between you and him is enormous. And so it's an important tool, and it really shows itself most when we see things like P8S or P7, where without these tools, the players who don't need them continue to thrive. But if we're really trying to create a nice gradient of, okay, there's players who thrive, and then there's players who push through, and then there's players who give it a shot, we end up kind of cutting out that middle group if we say no to literally everything, which feels weird because you don't need everybody to be like, I don't have to run a DPS meter because when I got my EX4 clear, somebody else was running one. And so when I realized, hey, I want to get better at EX4, I can go look up my mistakes because somebody logged me. They didn't ask me. They didn't ask me before they uploaded it. It's just up there. But I'm not upset about that because like I ended up pulling it up over on XIV Analytics and going, oh, wow, I'm really glad somebody broke terms.
I know.
Guess. Like, is that like I don't know how else to say that. Like I didn't tell them to do it. I didn't encourage them to do it. But it did get done.
You're benefiting from it.
But I'm benefiting from it.
Right.
I'm absolutely benefiting from it.
And that's where I like Yoshi P's stance. And again, I do not want live DPS meters. But what I do want is that XIV Analytics tool brought into the game. And it's also weird because really when you look at the game and its content, with like rare exception, everything before, extreme level difficulty and down, it just feels like it doesn't matter. The game basically says you're good. But then all of a sudden it's like, in order to get to this next level, like there's so much more required of you as a player that the rest of the game didn't train you on. And it would be so really cool to see if the game was like, especially like in normal content, I don't care how you're doing. I want to know how I'm doing and what I could do to get better. And to the point where like these tools should be in game at this point. I don't know how anybody can make the argument where they shouldn't, because people are being excluded.
Well, Sierra has to give me some mechanics.
It doesn't. It just is like, can you put out enough DPS in this amount of time? There's no mechanical, there's no movement, there's no, there's no uptime, there's no cooldowns. Like that tool is so archaic to the point where like when I look at this, when I look at Yoshi P's add-on stance, when I look at his DPS meter stance where he says DPS meters will never be in, it's like they are, and the terms of service are being broken, but nothing is happening because of it. But it has created this haves and have-nots, where the have-nots are running into that. Like maybe they don't want to do extreme. Maybe they're just perfectly fine with doing casual, and that's fine. That group is never really going to feel this impact. But what we're looking at is the player who wants to get better, who also wants to not break terms of service, who, like, how do you solve that problem? And the only answer is that the game should be teaching you these things. The game, whether that's through difficulty, where like, I can't clear this content. What happened? Oh, turns out like that's what Elden Ring does, right? Like Elden Ring teaches you the game because it will beat your face in, and either you're going to quit the game and walk away, or you're going to like stick around and play with. Its benefit is that it's not an ongoing live service game. So if you quit, like you've already given them the maximum amount of money they're going to get from you. So there's no disincentive for them playing that kind of game. And that's actually part of the appeal of that style game. But 14 in this case, when Yoshi P starts talking about like looking at these add-ons, like if he wants to really fulfill that promise, he has to look at whether maybe it's the duty recorder and actually opening it up to all the different duties and then providing an information in that. But it's so strange that when they announced that, I was so excited, especially in terms of content creation and machinima. Like if you were like, oh man, we could get some really cool angles for all this, and then it's like it's this weird tool that's used over here that's not really used. I don't think I've ever seen anybody talk about Duty Recorder in a positive way. My voice is failing.
And that we're not giving ourselves the ability to teach people who learn differently. You and I both thrived in math subjects in school, and you and I both struggled in reading, which means there is this argument that comes up all the time. Just read your tooltips. And you and I can read those words aloud. We can read them until we read them without mistakes. We can read them in a guide. It doesn't mean that I grasp them and then can execute on them without making mistakes. And yet, especially because not all mistakes are created equal, what happens when I get to a damage window, and that turns out that's the majority, is there are times during the fight that I need to be more focused on my rotation and make sure, okay, you're just in a position where you can stand largely still until you get better. Okay, this window's coming up. If I have to miss a global, I'd rather miss this. But like, how important? Not all abilities are equally important in your rotation. Yes, obviously getting them all would be great, but like, if I mess up my rotation on warrior and I drop a rotation by accident and I miss out on a little gauge or I overcap my gauge, that is very different than not popping infuriate inside of the 2-minute window when everybody else has everything going. That's a different ball game. And so like, but how do I know that? Because the math tells me that, because I visualize via math. So I can go look at the graphs and it helps me understand my mistakes. Now, I haven't spent enough time with the content to kind of see that get better, but I can sympathize with people who just want to be able to get through the content, and read your tooltips is not good enough information. Like, that's great that it works for the people it did work for. Great, we got those people. I'm not saying we should get rid of tooltips so that people who read them can't thrive.
Yeah.
Leave that in for them. But let's work on other learning methods as well so that we can catch these smaller buckets of people who just learn differently. How come Stone Sky Sea Air can't tell me that my Storm's Eye buff fell off?
Right.
Oh gosh, I got so busy
you dropped
focusing on
5
my
seconds
gauge that
exactly.
I forgot that.
You dropped it for 5 seconds, and that caught, you know, like,
and you lost,
right? Exactly. Meaning, like, but that's so genius. Like, you could use the tools that they have in game, and they could expand on, you know. And it's like, ultimately, yeah. Like, how much DPS did that 5 second cost you? And then, like, I think that's really good information to have. Now, Nevi Link in chat says, what does Duty Recorder actually do? And this is a great question to highlight kind of the point of the feature that Yoshi P talked about. Like, we're going to build a feature that no other game has in relation to DPS meters, right? Like, we're not doing DPS meters. We're going to build a tool. And they came out with Duty Recorder, in which that you all agree, and it's only specific duties that allow this. But if you think of Halo's theater mode, where you can play back the fight, look at different angles, look at what's all going on, everybody in your group has to agree, and it has to be in one of the approved recordable, pieces of content, and then you can actually use the tool. Thus, especially,
and it rotates like Unreal's. It's not an expanding number of duties.
Correct. So they've added some, and then so it just disappears, which I think is really ultimately unfortunate, because I would love to see that. From when they announced it, I was like, this is game changing for guide makers, you know, for all of this, because we could sit down and look at all the different angles, look at the different perspectives, rather than like have to record it. Chris and I, when we were
music
making
videos,
when we were
anything, lore videos,
do it. And
there's
now
a lot of cool stuff in there.
Yeah, and they brought out exploration mode, which is something I think was interesting. But I wonder if that piggybacked off of this, but it didn't have that value, in it. And so what frustrates me though is that I think this is going to be continual frustration, because the terms are clear. Yoshi P's stance is a flip of the coin. Will they enforce this, or will they not enforce this? Just don't talk about it. Or just don't show it on stream. You know, and especially since they started enforcing the streaming side of things, especially in terms of like how the game is perceived, like at the end of the day, I don't think this ends well unless they actually follow through on two promises. We're going to look at add-ons and actually bring those features into the game, which creates a feedback loop of keep making add-ons so we can get information of what we need. And then at the same time, I forgot the second point. The first one was so good. I forgot what my second one was.
We've got to get better about how we enforce this stuff. The way markers that's the topic that kind of brought this back up for this. We'll have a different form of add-on drama in 6.3's Ultimate if we get one. I keep saying if because like I'm more than understanding if they delay it to 6.5. They keep saying 6.3, and I keep saying I'll believe it when I see it. Not that's what they've said. They've said 6.3, but we have had Ultimates delayed in the past. It feels like they've been knocking an incredible amount of content out in this game. If that was delayed, I don't even think that would be like unexplainable. I think when you look at the amount of stuff that's come out, it'd be like, yeah, that makes sense. So I think that 6.4 is going to get another round of Savage. And so like add-on drama will continue popping up. But this one felt different. This one felt like all this person did was want a communication device that is in-game to function in a way that it is designed to function in-game. It doesn't feel like they went and built some whole software suite that's modifying game files. They're not logging anything that maybe somebody in the party doesn't want logged. Because like the thing about a DPS meter, one of the arguments is that like, can it breed toxicity? Because it lets me see not just my numbers, but it lets me see that pesky person in my party that's maybe not doing that's not trying to improve. They're not here with the best of intentions, and I can prove they're objectively not pulling their weight.
Right.
Like that. Right. It does lead to that there is an argument for that. But like all this person did was say, hey, in my parties, uniquely in my parties, I want to be able to place add-on markers. I don't know. It doesn't feel like as big of a deal. And like, if you're asking me black and white, is it against the rules? Yes, it's against the rules. Okay. They got a ban. Fine. But like, I hope it wasn't a permaban. I couldn't find anything on it, but I hope it wasn't. I hope it was like hey, don't do this again. Because it feels ridiculous that we would sacrifice a player for the great sin of saying, I just want to be able to communicate with people that want to clear this content with me that haven't cleared it before. I just think that'd be cool. I don't know. It's like if somebody expanded on the colorblind mode and like all it did was like add to the colorblind sliders in some way that like covered some whole type of colorblindness that people have. Like that just doesn't feel like where we want to be putting our energy. I'm not saying it's not against the rules. So like if they tweet, the official Square Enix account and go, look at this add-on I built, you're going to get banned. But like outside of that, right? If there's just like, oh, I went onto this colorblind Discord and I found these people like that are like trying to enjoy games, even though their eyes can't see the colors as they are on the screen. Let it go, man. Like it's fine. Well, it's fine.
And to that point,
I'm glad they're here.
To that point, in the second point that I was going to make that I now remember was like, and the spare no expense kind of mantra, where Farmer Girl points out that they did actually add the bigger cooldown timers to that. And that's great. Like but then that feeds back to the loop of like, well, in order to get these things that we've been asking for, what's going to come first? Is it the spare no expense now means that we have the ability to do these things, where before the answer was like, we just don't have the budget, versus, nowadays, like, okay, great, we can do this. And let's start with where the add-ons are and look at the delta there, the gap that these things are solving for. The cooldown timers, color blindness, the accessibility issues alone, that can help overall improve the game, that don't hurt anybody else's experience, right? Like this thing we're specifically talking about didn't hurt anybody's experience, but in and of its case, like, maybe the DPS meters would definitely hurt people's experience, but we already have a solution that I think that could evolve that, and so that it doesn't become that. But we'll have to ultimately wait and see in the long run to see, what happens with the spare no expense and with this, add-on kind of like chasing in, or ushering in hopefully a new era of features that have long been on people's lists. The reason why the add-ons exist is because they're like, there's that need. People are asking for these, and eventually, programmers are like, wait a minute, I think I can fix this. I can solve this. And so the drama also still kind of stems from when, like, even with Zeppla and other content creators saying, okay, let's talk about what add-ons could make this game better if bringing it in. And then you see the reaction like, no, the game is perfect the way it is. Don't like, da, da, da. It's like that mindset isn't logical. Like, it's Yoshi P's clearly saying they're going to do this. The conversation just shift to like, what would add value? What would make this game better? Nothing would make this game better. The game's perfect. Okay, well, you need to go sit in timeout because we don't have time to deal with somebody like you. Let's actually kind of live in, a space of, in a space of reality.
Both focused a huge amount of kind of their community on saying like, okay, well, if they want to know what we want, here's what we want. They both made separate lists and separate videos. They both collected things on Twitter and stuff like that. And I think that's a really good thing. To say like, okay, this game continues to add accessibility, continues to add settings, it continues to grow, it continues to add features, we continue to add new types of side content. And so within that context, is there anything that you would want that, for example, is already achievable if you're willing to break terms of service, but you're not? And so with that assumption, it's like, man, I see these people over here breaking the rules and they have this feature and I wish I had that feature. And so they've put a lot of that, like when we start to see the timers and stuff, that's what that is. That's a good thing that kind of grows the game. Because that add-on wasn't developed to like ruin the game. That add-on was developed to fix something that people do think, wow, that would be nice. It would be nice to be able to place that marker right there where it's going to matter later.
Exactly. Now, as we wrap up kind of the segment, because I think that really much covers it overall, I think it's a really interesting topic itself. I do want to shout out to Cole FFX hanging out in chat, guys. If you aren't following Cole's content, we've had him on the podcast. We're going to get him back on the podcast. I don't know if there's another Final Fantasy 14 content creator that gets as much hate in the community as us than Cole. Maybe he probably takes the cake. It's some of the things that he's shown me and put on Twitter. Just I'm like, it breaks my absolute ever living heart. I'm like, nobody needs to be dealing with that. So if you guys haven't yet seen,
Desparious is up there.
Desparious is up there. I haven't seen.
We're just trying to talk to people who are able to collect some pretty incredibly outlandish comments.
Okay, we should tier list the most, like, you know, like the Final Fantasy Andy's like content creator hate tier list.
We could have awards.
Yeah,
like people with a play button, people without a play button. We could have different tiers.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be so funny. That would. It's something that's really weird about this community, guys, and you know, like we talk about it. Hopefully not too much.
They produce 10 videos or more a month. You know, that way the quantity of hate can really build up quicker, as opposed to people who just post occasionally but receive hate.
How dare you make free content that I can enjoy? Yeah, completely ignore.
Ignore. Like, for the haters, ignore. Because we're not talking about people who enjoy it. Obviously, they can find it.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, is like I now to the point where it's like some of the stuff that Cole, like, I've seen him post, and Chris bringing up Desperate, I'm like, oh, Desparious, excuse me, like, oh my gosh, like it is so weird.
Over on some Discords.
Oh, and not on that, like, it's always really funny when then you see it spill over into Reddit, where people like on Reddit like to sit here and just talk like the content creation piece of it. Like, that's what kicked off the whole.
It's back to the read your own tooltip. They're like, I don't know why they can't just use our written guides. Our written guides are perfect. Okay, well, some people like video guides. So, like you said, his isn't perfect. Then go make a better one.
It kind of makes me
clearly you spent 2 hours writing up a post on all the things you hate about him. Making that guide would apparently take you less time than that.
Here's my thought when I hear somebody say something like that. It's like somebody arguing the printing press was like publishing perfection, and we should never have done anything after that. We figured it all out back in the 1400s, 1500s, whenever the hell that was invented, and we're good. We said, like, my dad literally in a car ride one day, he looked at me, and this is like right in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and he's like, I just don't know how technology could get any better than what it is right now. And I'm like, I looked at him, I go, well, thank God you're not in charge. Like, all right, like, okay, we figured it all out. We're done. Like, are we? Like, interesting stuff, but that'll be fun. Anyway, again, shout out to Cole, guys. If you guys see his name, see his content, go check it out. He's got an affinity for healing, and much more than that. But I always kind of like to see kind of his takes on healers in Final Fantasy. And so, yeah, shout out to Cole. Thanks for being here in the live chat.